This is not an official podcast of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution, NSDAR, and does not necessarily represent the position of the NSDAR. This interview is being conducted for the Daughter Dialogues Oral History Project. The interviewer is Risha Rainey. The narrator is Nikki Williams Sebastian. Nikki, please tell me where you are from.
I am from St. Louis, Missouri.
And to what generation do you belong?
I am Generation X.
Tell me a little bit about your childhood and your parents.
Well, as I mentioned, grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. My mother was an elementary school teacher. She was a counselor in St. Louis, the testing counselor in the Ferguson-Florissant School District. And my father owned his own business. He had a record store. He called it The Shop, and it was called Soundtown Records and Tapes. And he also had a TV show where he promoted different records, and that was all in the 70s, 60s, 70s in St. Louis, Missouri.
Did you go on to college?
I did. I attended Tulane University in New Orleans. There I studied history, and I had planned to be an attorney.
What did you go on to do as your career?
I work in public health. I am what's called a public health informatician. I study public health informatics. And
Wait, how did you get into public health from a history degree?
Oh, well, that's an easy story. Well, after I graduated from Tulane in New Orleans, I moved to Atlanta. And at that time when I graduated in the mid to late 90s was the dot-com boom. When I moved to Atlanta, I was just looking for a job, and that's where I started working in the IT field.
But then how did it transition to public health informatics?
I got a job at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, and it was an IT-based role. Because in public health, to clarify, we do surveillance, we do epidemiology, there's all types of information gathering that happens in public health. And when we gather that information, when scientists gather that information has to be placed somewhere. It has to go into a system. It has to go into a database. It goes into a website so that it's prepared for reporting and produce and dissemination to the public. And IT systems are the backbone of that.
Did you ever study public health?
I did. After so many years at CDC, I wanted to go ahead and continue my education some more. And I found out that Emory University, Emory's right next door to CDC, and there was a new program of study at Emory's public health school called informatics, public health informatics. And I thought that would be a good mix because when there's always sometimes a disconnect between people, the developers, people who do IT, and then the people like the scientists, the medical doctors, and there's sometimes a lack of communication between those two. And the public health informatics person is to be a bridge between that so we can get software developed that has the backbone of public health, that meets the needs of public health goals to save lives, to protect people, to protect children, and to get that into an IT application that meets the needs for that.
I can only imagine that is very important right now in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes, it is. It is. We have a lot of work going on right now. It's very serious, and everyone needs to wear their masks. What can I say?
So I know we aren't able to move about like we used to during this time. Are there some hobbies that you like to do or would normally do under normal circumstances?
Well, now that we're in our homes and we have to the work from home and we have to not move about and stay safe, I find that I have more time for genealogy, and I just have more time to work on the cases that I have, and that's just something that's always been with me. My parents, they instilled a love of genealogy in me early, both my mother and my father.
When you talk about cases, what are your cases?
On my father's side, I found a couple of ancestors. My father told me a long time ago he had a business card in his wallet, and it was a campaign card for his mother's grandfather, Ira A. Dorsey. He would carry this campaign card in his wallet because it inspired him. And a long time ago, he handed me this card and said, "This is your ancestor." And he was the first Black elected official in the city of St. Louis. And don't ever forget that. And so he made a copy of the card on the copy machine at his store, and he made me put that in my pocket and carry it with me at all times. That I had an ancestor who was a first, who did things, and he told me that his father was the first Black mailman in St. Louis, Missouri, and there were no one else. He was the first one to have that job, and everyone came in after him. That's the only job everyone did after, our ancestor came in there first. My mother, on the other hand, we always attended my mother's side family reunions for many years. Every 2 years we would have family reunions. So that's where I got started.
What are some interesting stories that you have uncovered other than the one you just shared?
Well, I have a couple of stories. The first one on my father's side, since my father told me that about his ancestor, Ira Dorsey, I was able to trace that Ira's wife, Ira A. Dorsey, the one that my father said was the first Black elected official. I was able to research his wife's family. And his wife's family, I found an ancestor in her line called Hark West. And I saw in the 1870 census that he was a horse trainer. And he was famous. He was a trainer, a thoroughbred racehorse trainer, is what that actually meant. And just through tying things together and research and finding newspaper articles, I was able to find out that he was a trainer of several famous horses, but the most famous of all, the racehorse was named LeCompte. And LeCompte was a son of Boston. Boston was one of the most famous horses ever in the history, a famous sire in the history of United States racing. And of course, Boston had sired plenty of horses over his many years, but one of the two famous horses, Lexington and LeCompte, were in a famous race in New Orleans in 1854. And my ancestor trained one of the horses in 1854. And the name of the race was called the Great State Post Stakes. And that was a famous race. It was referred to nowadays. In the 70s, I saw an article. It was the Super Bowl of the 19th century. And to put that in context, that means that horse racing was the only mass spectator sport in the 19th century, in the 1850s, to be specific, in the 1860s. And that was the first time that tens of thousands of Americans had gathered together in one place was to watch famous horses, to watch horse racing. And my ancestor was the trainer of one of the most famous horses. So at that race, there were other horses. There were about 4 or 5 horses in that, but everyone came to see Lexington and LeCompte. And Lexington, out of all this, even though I mentioned my ancestor, Lexington became the most famous horse ever of the 19th century. But my ancestor had, through his training of LeCompte, had handed this famous horse his first and only defeat. And Lexington's skeleton is in the Smithsonian, is my understanding at this time, because he was that famous and people just want to keep his skeleton. But that was just a story that I found. And as I mentioned, that race was held in New Orleans. And the racetrack where that was held is now the Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans. And that, if you go to that cemetery, if you view that cemetery you can view it online, but the cemetery is in the shape of a racetrack.
And your ancestor, he was African American?
Yes, he was. He was in... Yes, and I found about him, not just at his race, I found out he was a slave, because horse training at that time was run primarily by Blacks, both enslaved and free Blacks. And my ancestor, through my research, I found out where he was enslaved. He was from Greensville County, Virginia. And I found out the name of his slave owner, his enslaver. His name was Dr. Alexander Thomas Belfield Merritt. And Dr. Merritt was a wealthy man for some time. He had plantations all over the country. He had plantations in Virginia. He lived in Richmond. He practiced in Richmond. He had plantations in Vicksburg. He had plantations in Louisiana, St. Bernard Parish. So just all over the place. And it seems to me that wherever my ancestor was training, as he traveled west, because he eventually traveled to Louisiana. He was in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, but he traveled west as the country expanded west. And at that time, Mississippi and Louisiana was known as the West. And my ancestors' training jobs moved west as the country grew and the population swelled and horse races became more popular. And it seems to be that Merritt followed his work as he went west. So did Merritt. So did his owner, Dr. Merritt.
And what do you do with this information? How do you document it? How do you share it with others?
I've given a few presentations about this because it was a process and how I was able to figure this out, and how just from going from that census record in 1870 and how I was able to find this great state post stakes, how I was able to pin all that together. I've had presentations at the South Carolina Genealogical Society, and I also traveled to Louisiana and attended a conference there where I spoke about that as well. And my plan is I'm working on a book currently to kind of put all this down and explain that. And actually, I have another enslaved ancestor that I would like to share because it's very important when we find enslaved ancestors, because it can be very difficult to find records for us to go back that far, because a lot of times some like to say that Black people, African Americans, have a hard time getting past 1870, and I found multiple ancestors through that 1870 brick wall that I was able to get through, because another ancestor that I found was a United States colored troop soldier, and his name was Zachariah Harris, and he was from Garrett County, Kentucky. He joined the Union Army at Camp Nelson, Kentucky, in July of 1864. And Camp Nelson is a historic, it's a park now operated by the National Park Service. And Camp Nelson was a site specifically set aside to recruit and train African Americans to fight in the Civil War. And Camp Nelson became a refugee camp because as these soldiers came to enlist and leave slavery or run away from slavery, their families followed them. And Camp Nelson had thousands and thousands of Black people living there. And there was like a refugee camp there was families and kids in camp while these men were training because their families had nowhere else to go. They were joining the army. They couldn't leave their family behind in slavery. And Camp Nelson just became this big deal that Lincoln, the Union Army, had to deal with at Camp Nelson. So all that history is at the National Park Service for that. And another thing that I found out after slavery was over with Zachariah, he moved to Vicksburg. He moved into Mississippi. The U.S. government had given land, had told these U.S. colored troop soldiers that they were to be given land for their service. And the United States government in Vicksburg had taken over the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. The United States confiscated Jefferson Davis's property and handed it to United States colored troops. And my ancestor was one of those soldiers who lived on that property. And I think it was 1880 where I found my ancestor, Zachariah Harris, living in Davis Bend, Mississippi. And Davis Bend was the name of Jefferson Davis's property in Mississippi. Now, Jefferson Davis did sue for the return of his property, and he was successful. Over years, he was finally given his land back. So I just want to reiterate that I found my ancestor who fought for the Civil War. He was a soldier. Through his bravery, through his valor, through whatever his role was in the army, he was awarded land. And then that same government that awarded him the land reneged on that promise. And they rewarded the president of the Confederacy. He was rewarded with his land back. And these Black soldiers were asked to leave or had to leave or were kicked off or thrown off or whatever the situation was. So I found that very interesting, and just, some of these lesser known stories that we find when we research our family trees. I believe that every one of us, when we research our families, we find some piece of history that we can contribute to the overall story of the story that is America. But I did not know this story. I didn't know that Jefferson Davis, like the same thing that happened with Robert E. Lee in Arlington House with his property. His property was confiscated, and it was formed to make Arlington National Cemetery. And the same thing happened to other, high officers in the Confederacy. The same thing happened to Jefferson Davis. But as I mentioned, in his case, he got his property back, and my ancestor was kicked off despite his service.
And what do you think? What do you think these stories will do for people when they hear them?
Having these stories, it makes people more knowledgeable. It educates people. It helps to enrich the American story, the American narrative, that what soldiers did. And in this particular story, about Jefferson Davis and all this going on with the Confederate monuments and all that, I have family that's involved in that. I have family that fought in the war. I have family that dealt with the Confederacy. I have ancestors who were enslaved with people who fought for the Confederacy. This is real. I have these stories, and not everyone can find these stories. So I think when we don't find our stories, we make it easy for people to cover up our stories or ignore our stories or pretend that our stories don't exist. Well, as what's happening now, there's a lot of Confederate monuments being, people are getting rid of these monuments. People are tired of these monuments. And there's a history behind that we have to discuss. And when you search your family history, you can see the truth about what these monuments represent. And for my family, this Jefferson Davis, has monuments, and I'm sure in lots of places, but Jefferson Davis he didn't take land. It was his land, of course, in the beginning, but my ancestor was rewarded this man's land, but he got that land back, even though he fought against the United States. But my ancestor got nothing, and he put on the Union blue in support to defend the nation. So that's the story that we have about Confederates. And just, my particular one story, there's thousands of stories like that. If all of us would just dig just enough to find our stories, we can help kind of put this issue to bed about what the truth was.
Are you helping people try to dig? Is this a hobby, or is this a second career?
I think it could be both. You never know. I just can't give this up. I am always learning. As I mentioned, I'll say again, if we don't write our stories down, we don't tell our stories, no one else will. So it's one thing to research. It's one thing to find all these files and have a file folder full of stuff. But if you don't write it down, the information won't get out there, and it won't be shared. It won't inspire. It won't help people to answer questions about their family.
Do you ever publish any of these stories?
Yes, I did write something for the Louisiana Historical Society. They had a little contest that I saw that I applied, and I was invited to attend the conference, and I spoke about my ancestor because this was a Louisiana sports story, and Louisiana was the center of racing before the Civil War. And so when I submitted a story, a proposal for this story, they were interested, and they did have me come give a speech about that. And I did write a small paper.
Well, tell me about your Revolutionary War ancestor.
My Revolutionary War ancestor's name was Edward Barrett, and he was from Halifax County, North Carolina, and his wife was Priscilla Marshall.
Was Edward of European descent or African descent?
Edward Barrett was white, a white man plantation owner in North Carolina. And I found the documentation that I have for him is called a pay indent that I found. And he was already a established patriot, meaning I didn't have to prove to any lineage society that he was a patriot. His information, someone had already done the work, and he was already added to the DAR database.
Daughters of the American Revolution database.
Yes, thank you. Daughters of the American Revolution database. He was already an established patriot that I found, and his documentation was a pay indent. And a pay indent was an irregular shaped piece of paper that was used as a check, pretty much, to simplify. And when someone donated supplies and support to the state, they were given a pay indent. And I saw that Edward Barrett had a pay indent in the amount of 460 pounds that was given to him in 1781.
But how did you even find out that you had a Revolutionary War ancestor?
Oh, well, to the beginning of that story is that as I mentioned, my mother's family, we are the Black Okellys, and we have family reunions every 2 years.
You have to tell me about that name, the Black Okellys. Where does that come
Oh,
from?
the Black Okellys is because there are white Okellys. And as we were doing our research, we wanted to designate our family and kind of help us stand out with our particular story. And so my cousin insisted that we call ourselves the Black Okellys. And the reason why that is because we had family reunions and that we would call ourselves the Okelly reunions. But as we grew and, as the internet came about, we saw there were other Okellys. There were other Okelly reunions and just a number of groups of Okellys. And I'll get into that later, but that makes sense because as I get back into the lineage, there was a man that had almost 20 children. So there's a lot of Okellys floating around. But that was just a way to kind of designate us in our story.
What is the origin of that name, Okelly?
The name Okelly comes initially from what I found from Darlington, South Carolina. And I was able to find that because there were the records that named this man in Darlington, but I was at the Family Research Center in Georgia, one of the centers in Georgia, and there was a friend there. There was not a friend, wasn't a friend then, but I was asking for help. And I was asking the people working there, I said, yes, I'm looking for Okellys, and I have information that they were in Darlington, South Carolina. And I was trying to find out more information if you knew. So I was, going on, and some woman popped her head up who was researching. She said, Darlington. She was, talking across the room like, who are you looking for in Darlington? I said, the Okelly family, James Okelly is the name that I have. And she was like, Darlington. I know the Okelly family. I can help you with that. And so that's how I met my friend Renee and how she was able to. It turns out that Renee was from Darlington, born and raised. And I just happened to be in the Family History Center on the day that that I was researching Darlington. And I had to be there on the day that someone was from Darlington, born and raised. And she immediately took me under her wing. And we ended up driving to Darlington, and I met her research friends there. I did a lot of research at the Darlington County Historical Commission, and I met people there. Johnny Andrews helped me. They knew about apparently there's a ton of streets with the name Okelly in the county that I had no idea about. And in doing that, that was an example of why it's important to visit the places. When you're researching family, it's not the same online. And when you're researching on the internet or at all these websites, ancestry, nothing will ever replace getting in the car, driving to the name of the place that's on the documents that you find for the people that you're researching. Because by driving to Darlington and meeting Johnny and showing me the files and the information, that was what helped me to pinpoint and kind of focus in that I had the right track with the right family. So that trip was very important. And then we also did DNA testing because the Black Okellys, we have a website and we put our information out there. So in addition, you were asking how do we share our information and where do we put it? Our website is where we put a lot of information. So we were talking about our family, and to back up a bit, the Black Okellys, we trace our line from 3 brothers. And there's Daniel Okelly, the oldest. The middle son was Will Okelly, and then there was a third son, Charles Okelly. And we have our family reunions because the descendants of those three brothers, that's what we call the Black Okellys.
Where are they all from?
They were from Mississippi, and the county was in Wilkinson County, and the town was called Perrytown in Woodville, Wilkinson County, Mississippi. And that's where they lived. They were enslaved on that plantation with their mother. And their mother was named Ellen Johnson Matthews Fisher. We see her with different names throughout her life, but those were the names that we have with her. And Ellen was enslaved on the Okelly plantation in Mississippi. And she was also enslaved across the river, across the Mississippi in Louisiana. So we see records with her there with his brother. His brother had a plantation across the river in Tennessas in Louisiana. So how we got from Darlington to Mississippi is that the three brothers left Darlington and they migrated west. Again, I mentioned earlier that the west, where as far as people can go, was the Mississippi River. And that's as far as those brothers went. They migrated and set up plantations in the Natchez district. Counties in Louisiana and also counties in Mississippi that together made up the Natchez district. And that's essentially where these brothers decided to set up shop in that part of town when they left Darlington.
So the Black Okellys descend from these three brothers.
Correct. And these three brothers descend from these plantation owners, these white men. And our ancestor, Ellen, she had children by these white Okellys and who owned her. And our story was that she was beaten. There was a story that she had lost an eye. One of the stories that we have that we put on our website. And it was a story that she was a nanny for James, but the particular brother was James Okelly. And my aunt also said that she was a breeder. Story said that she was a breeder. She was purchased to bear children. That was one of the stories. And exactly like The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood's novel. In that book, she talks about, in the story, that she talks about women who are captured to have children. That's essentially what happened to Ellen. That's what we were told. That's a family story. And we have the DNA to prove it, that she had children at least from these Okellys, but she had other children as well that we were able to confirm as well. But as the oldest brother was Daniel, again, I mentioned Will, and then there was Charles. But James Okelly died in about 1867. And she had another child named Charles Okelly around 1870. And we were able to pinpoint which brother that was, John Beatty Okelly. And of course, these men had families. Each of them had white families, but they also had these children with our ancestor Ellen. And she was a lot younger. I know Ellen was 20-year difference thereabouts between her and James Okelly. So I know she was a young girl, and that's what happened to her. And we were able to confirm that because that's the story that was passed down from her to her sons, that was passed down to us, that these men were the father of her children.
Have you ever contacted the white Okellys?
We have. We are in contact with them. We have met them. And how that came about was because my cousin Joyce had found James Okelly and had identified which Okelly brother. Because, as I mentioned, there were several brothers. We didn't know who. We just knew it was Okelly in Wilkinson County and which brother was it. And we were able to get that all pinned down because we found death certificates from the brothers. And they had James Okelly. But another brother had Charles Okelly. The youngest brother had Charles Okelly. And as I mentioned, James died. But the other child, Charles, said his father was John Okelly. And we did do DNA test, and we were able to confirm the match for that. And how that came about, how we were able to come in contact with them, is that one of the white descendants of the Okellys saw our website, and he contacted us, and he offered to pay for some Y-DNA tests to test our hypothesis, our theory, and that these were the brothers. And that's how we were able to confirm that, because that was a generous offer.
Did he say why he was interested in having DNA test done?
Because we had his ancestor named on the website, and he just wanted to confirm that the information that we were putting out there. And I'm sure if the DNA didn't come through, his next request would have been to take his ancestor's name off of there.
Okay. And so when the results came back, what happened?
When the results came back, we tested again because we had different markers. The markers varied. So some of them had exact matches, and then some of the cousins tested to some other people. There were 0-step matches, some were 2-step matches. So it just became more interesting when it wasn't a 0-step match. And I don't know if you're familiar with Y-DNA, but when you do a 0-step match, that means it's a perfect match. All of the markers that are passed down from father to son are unchanged through each generation. But then when you have 1-step marker, that means that somewhere along the line that the DNA did change, and then that change was passed down to the subsequent sons from where that change occurred.
How did this white man from the white Okellys who asked you to do this DNA test react when he found that was an exact match to the black Okellys?
Well, he was fine as far as I can tell. It was interesting. He, was helpful. Whatever information that he had about his Okelly ancestor, he was very forthcoming and helpful. And we were able to get information. The files that he had pictures. He just had a lot of information. He was very, very, very helpful. Very helpful. And we're very appreciative for that, because we wouldn't be as far as we are as we were able to dig without them making it easy for us and kind of just extending a hand to help us out. So I give them full credit for that.
Now, when I hear Okelly, and a lot of people hear that name, they think it's Irish. What is the origin of that?
Oh dear, the origin of that makes no sense. It's not Irish. It's the DNA has proven it traces back to England. I mean, and it still leads there, but it's not. The Okelly, the DNA has led us down a rabbit hole to a whole nother place. And the DNA led to a different family. I mean, although our Okellys that's the name, and we have the progenitor of that. We trace to a man named David Kelly, that all of these men that I've mentioned who've done the DNA testing, the black and white, they all trace to this common male ancestor, David Kelly, in Darlington. But no one could ever get past David Okelly. None of the white researchers, there were people who paid money to research this man and see if he was a Revolutionary Era patriot. No one could ever find this man, anything about this man. But the DNA that we acquired from all the cousins pointed to a different family, pointed to a Perry family. And it pointed to the family of a man named John Perry of Virginia. But the name, our DNA, this Okelly DNA, pointed us to a John Perry family. And after that, his descendant in Bertie County, North Carolina, is where this DNA path trail led us to. And through Bertie County, it pushed us back up to Virginia and back into London, England. So the Okellys were very excited because, they were Irish. That's who they did St. Patrick's Day. That was a big thing. That was their thing. And then the DNA was telling them that they weren't Irish at all. They were British, and that was a problem. That wasn't a happy time.
Join us for the next episode for the continuation of this story and what happens when the two sides of the Okelly family meet, and hear about Nikki's experience as a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution.